Thank you. First of all, thank you everybody who's joining us for the second Native Filmmaker Initiative Film Club of this season, brought to you by Big Sky Film Institute. My name is Julia Sherman. I'm the education coordinator for the Institute. And the film club is in its second screening of the season, and it's a youth outreach education program that brings curated Indigenous and Native American documentaries into classrooms across the state of Montana. We are in partnership with the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, who help fund this program, and Vision Maker Media, who help provide the content for this program. I work really closely with Mike Jetty, who's an Indian education specialist for Office of Public Instruction, who is here with us today. And we also have with us, who took some time out of her busy schedule, Karen Cantor, who is the filmmaker for the film that we'll be talking about today. And so I'll do a quick brief intro to the film, and then we'll do introductions. I know we have a few classes here, and I'd love to hear from you in a minute. But before we get started, the film that we're going to be screening today is Return. Native American women reclaim foodways for health and spirit. And this film is a short expose following the food sovereignty movement across the country through stories of Native American women of various tribes. So we'll be following 6 tribes of the Oglala Sioux, Menominee, Muckleshoot, Santa Clara Pueblo, Tlingit, and the Seneca Nation. And we'll be using these stories to tie it into Montana-based Indian Education for All. And Mike, who will be joining us here today, was going to help us make those connections. And Mike, did you want to introduce yourself really quick before we jump into things?
Hello, my relatives. Mike Jetty, Indian Education Specialist here with the Office of Public Instruction. I'm really glad to be part of the conversation today, and enjoyed watching the film. And I made sure to eat before watching the film. I didn't get too hungry. I watched it, but look forward to the conversation and dialogue. So thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. And also with us is the director, producer, and writer of the film, Karen Cantor. Do you want to introduce yourself very briefly,
Sure.
Karen?
Well, thank you for having me. This is a privilege and an adventure. I've never done anything quite like this. I'm delighted that more and more people are seeing the film, and my hopes are that it makes an impact. And as we talk, we'll talk more about how that can happen.
Great, thank you. So before we get started today, before we dive into the content of this film, I think a few classrooms have seen the film already, but for those of you that haven't, I want to just kind of start make sure that we're all on the same page before diving into this content. And I want to brainstorm a few ideas surrounding identity, culture, and community, because these are really reoccurring themes throughout the film. The Film Club season this year, we're focusing around the theme of restoration, and specifically through this film, we're exploring how food, and diet connect with different elements of cultural expression and revitalization of tribal identities. So students, I just want to show, I've written up a few specific, I hope you can kind of see this. But so throughout this film, we're going to be talking about and distinguishing between these 3 things. So for identity, we have the qualities and beliefs of an individual. And for those of you that have seen the film, we'll give a little bit more backstory on it in a second for those of you that haven't. Identity qualities are things that you identify or personalize with, such as Roxanne in the film, for example, is a mother, she's an artist, she's a grandmother, a gardener, a wife. Those are just a few examples of identity. Culture, on the other hand, are shared beliefs, traditions, and practices of a group. So with Roxanne, for example, by connecting with her Santa Clara Pueblo roots, she follows a tradition of harvesting and hunting practices that are specific to the Santa Clara Pueblo tribe. So she's connecting the food with the land and her people through cultural traditions. Community is a feeling of wanting to be with a people or of caring about other people in a larger group. So we make these connections with the Roxanne example, for example, as they partake in a 3-month-long journey in incorporating traditional diet into their everyday, and they kind of realize this value of food connection to the language, tradition, and these bigger things. So I wonder if all the students participating can write these 3 things down, and either writing down these definitions or your own personal definitions for what identity, culture, and community might mean to you. I just want you to backlog that in your brain as we dive into these kind of bigger story that we'll be exploring with return. So as we get started, can I get a raise of hands from the classes that were able to watch the film before this discussion? Oh, great.
Yep.
So to kind of kick off, Karen, I wonder if you might talk a little bit about, first maybe give your own brief synopsis of the film, and talk a little bit about how you first got involved with making this film.
The film is, to me, about how people can take charge and make a difference. And in this case, we're talking about women, 6 different women, who see in their communities unhealth. I don't want to say disease. We can look at the rates of diabetes in the Native American community, and they see that there's people are sick and they want to make a difference. So it is, and they make a difference. It's not only that they want to, but they make a difference. They take it upon themselves. And so we have women who are inspired to change things. And another really important part of the film is the different ways they go about it. There's not one way to make a difference. The featured women in the film, some of them are dietitians. So they already have contact with a knowledge of what people eat and why it matters. One's an exercise specialist. One's a community, a specialist in community activism. And Roxanne, who's actually a sculptor who's been long interested in foods. So why did I do this? I did it because I had moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico. I became really aware of the Native American presence. I had made 3 documentary films before this. I wanted to make another. I was trained in anthropology as an undergraduate, knew a little bit about respecting other cultures and that every culture is valid, and that's a really important precondition. And was interested in what's going on. And I started hearing about Native Americans being obese and overweight. And then I started to do an internet search, and I found Roxanne. And I can summarize and say the rest is history. Of course, there's a lot more to it.
Yeah, and we'll dive into the kind of history of that, especially with regards to Native American history and the history of reservations. But I wanted to first kind of talk about, in the film, they mention how difficult it can be to eat healthy and eat according to a more traditional diet, or a diet that is specific to what you have access to. And I know with regards to Montana, and I know we have schools coming in from the East Coast as well, so feel free to put your inputs of specific examples that you have around your area. It is sometimes difficult to have access to certain foods that don't easily grow in those areas or aren't easily accessible in grocery stores. So I'm wondering if maybe we could get an example from a participating school to, as we talk about what factors make it hard to get healthy foods. In the film, they kind of talk about access, taste change, lifestyle, and habit. Can I maybe have one participating student give us an example?
What if we start with this is Bartlett's class?
Yeah, I see a hand raised.
Yep, you'll have to unmute your microphone.
Why is it hard to get healthy food?
Because some of the species have been extinct.
Can you hear us?
Yes, we can hear you. Can you say that one more time?
Some of the native species that they used as a food source have gone extinct.
Yeah. Can you give us an example of what one of those species might be?
I'm not sure. Buffalo did decrease drastically.
Yeah, that's a really great example. And actually in the film, I think it was it the Oglala Sioux representative kind of talks about losing contact with the buffalo, with the migration here. And I'm actually going to pass this question along to Mike, if you don't mind tying this history in with our essential understandings and diving in a little bit specific to Montana history.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
You're a little muffled, but I can hear you.
All right. Well, I'm thinking what happened to, indigenous peoples here in North America, and then specifically in Montana. Just traditionally you had access to, all kinds of resources that were all around you. And you had a deep spiritual connection that was for thousands of years to these resources, like, for the Lakota, the buffalo. And, once that resource was gone and diminished, it's like, what did you do for food? And, it hasn't been that long with the native communities that the diet, had a dramatic change. And that's why we see all these higher rates of, diabetes and obesity and all these other health issues that are related to our diet. And so, not having access to those healthy traditional foods that you have this deep relationship with has really had an impact. And that's why, when I see films like The Return, it really gives me a good sense of hope and seeing, native communities going back to their traditions, to their ceremonies, and becoming, more self-sufficient. Because we look at federal Indian policy and the old reservation system in that era, the federal government really wanted native people to become dependent upon them. And, to get rid of traditions and languages and ceremonies, and that really had a devastating impact. And so I think, going back to traditions and relationships with food can, heal that historic trauma that's been going on in Native communities. So I think when I see things like what's going on in this film across Indian country, it really gives me a sense of hope that, there's a lot of good things happening out there, and we need to share these stories. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does. And I think that kind of makes me think of, in the film, I believe it's Valerie Segrist of Muckleshoot background, says that food sovereignty is a way of living together in a community where you're bound for life to the food. And having access to certain foods is also having access to certain cultures. And I'm wondering if there's a class that can maybe give us an example of foods that you grow or harvest that are specific to where you live.
I think we should go around and hear from each of the classes that are participating. And, it doesn't have to be something super unique. It's just something that comes from where you are, something that's part of your diet or your lifestyle. Can we start with, let's see here. Mrs. Duger's class up in Arlee.
All right, I was just talking with my student, and he doesn't really have an example of anything that he grows. I have an example. My husband is an attorney, and he has clients who are from the reservation, and we've been paid with elk. And so that's a way that I suppose that I'm not from here, but it is a way that we take part in historic food that has been used historically.
Mm-hmm. Great example. Let's move over to, is it Lori Tokarin's class? Your microphone is muted, so you'll have to unmute your microphone. You can also type in if you would like. While we're waiting for that, let's go over to Mrs. Bartlett's class, and then we're going to go over to Mr. Westgate's after Mrs. Bartlett's.
So we are thinking huckleberries and elk.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely.
Huckleberries especially. And I think that this brings up a good point too, the huckleberries and the elk. As far as grazing land, Montana is very much a landlocked state. And I know in the film we follow Tlingit, which is southwest Alaska, and Seneca Nation, which is all the way on the other side of the country, and Menominee, which is in what is now Wisconsin area, and we also have the Muckleshoot, which is northwestern. So I think that brings up a really good point of foods that are specific to the geography
Yeah.
of a place.
When we have the Mrs. Tucker's class, and I hope I'm saying that correctly, they have wheat crops that they harvest, and they also harvest deer.
Mm-hmm.
One of the other things is that Mrs. Duggar's class also says that her student has harvested bitterroot and cooked it with huckleberries. And Mr. Westgate's class is saying in their area, they have the three sisters, the corn, the bean, and the squash, which I know was talked about.
That was mentioned in the film. And actually, I'll kind of put this question to Karen. So in the film, they mention these three sisters, which is corn, beef, squash, which was mentioned by one of the classrooms that watched the film. Do you mind expanding on a little bit these three sisters and kind of how they're this happy marriage, this perfect marriage of nutrients?
I'd be happy to as much as I can. So, which has its limits. I think one interesting thing first is that the three sisters are grown and eaten all over the country, but they're different. So, for instance, the temporary bean is grown in Arizona, and that's a bean that withstands drought very well. So, and we all know there are many different kinds of squash. Well, likewise, there are many different kinds of beans. My understanding is the beans put nitrogen back in the soil, and that helps the others grow. As corn is different all over the country. We have corn of many colors, and we have what has become yellow corn, and we're all familiar with the corn that's grown simply to feed livestock. So I think to me it's really fascinating that the three sisters are all over the country and that they are different all over the country, which again, I'm not answering your question fully, but again highlights the differences regionally that we get. And in terms of, I think the film explains it very well, Kibikante, that they supply the nutrients for humans, the carbohydrates, the combo proteins, and there's water in squash, there's water in each one of these. So indeed, they have value, and we can be pretty well nourished just by eating corn, beans, and squash.
Well, and that brings up a really excellent point. I know I've talked to Mike a little bit about this, but Mike, maybe you can highlight, I know this is in the essential understandings of this kind of diversity of foods and also diversity of tribes and these different ways that we eat that then kind of come through within cultural traditions. Do you mind expanding on that a little bit more, Mike?
Sure. Can I throw up a little quote here from Valerie? Let's see if I can share my screen. All right. Can you see that?
Can we?
Yes.
Yes.
I really like what Valerie's talking about. She said this land is our identity, and it holds the answers we need. So I really like that. Within Indian communities, oftentimes we look to the outside, but we have all the answers right there in our own traditions. And so she's talking about elk, salmon, huckleberries, and shellfish. How they're central to who they are, to their identity. And I really like how you framed that at the beginning with an identity, culture, and community, because he ties all three of those things into this quote. And so one of our new resources that we're putting out there for schools across Montana is all about food sovereignty, and we call it Finding Our Roots. But in this picture up here on the left, you see Salish women drying meat in 1910. And then below, you see the Salish and Kalispé Cultural Committee annual Bitterroot dig from 2018. And so these traditions, these ceremonies, this relationship with food is still ongoing. And I think that's powerful. So I just wanted to share that. I've got a few more slides I could share later on, but I thought that was a great quote, you know, and thinking about the diversity of the tribes and their location, you know, the relationships they have with that food depends on that. Like the Dene, the Navajo have a really cool relationship with corn and the seeds and the stories they have around those seeds. And that's exciting to hear. But, you know, just there's a lot of diversity out there, and it depends on your location and the types of foods that you harvest and still harvest. And you know how that ties into your culture. I'm glad you said that.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. And it makes me think of kind of on the flip side of that. I know one thing that was brought up in the film was the history of fry bread. And I wonder if I can get a show of hands with anybody in the classrooms of anybody that's had fry bread or maybe been to a powwow and had fry bread.
I've seen a lot. Hey, I wonder, I see that we have Jesse's class that joined us. Jesse, hello, welcome. Would you mind muting your microphone because we're getting a lot of feedback from you guys?
Thanks so much. So, as I was saying, so there was mention of this kind of taste change with the introduction of fry bread as kind of a survival food. I know that it's, you know, it's very tasty and we've all kind of had it maybe as fair food, but Karen, I wonder if you don't mind talking a little bit about some of this history that's introduced in the film, and then I'll kind of punt it over to Mike to talk a little bit more of the essential understandings connection there. But Karen, why don't you take it away?
Sure. I hope everybody will not be very angry at me for debunking the fry bread as a native food. It came about when tribes were being put on reservations and cut off from their food sources. And the commodity program had begun, and what was sent was flour and lard. And what do you do with that? And it was pioneer women who showed the Native Americans that they could mix it all together and fry it up, and then there was fry bread. And it became a source of sustenance, but really not a source of nutrition. It really doesn't deliver a lot of protein and vitamins and other things that we really need to thrive. So that's the sad story of the beginning of fry bread. And all the powwows I've been to always feature fry bread. And just because it's good doesn't mean it's good for you. And I'm just sorry to say that.
Well, that's a really good point. And I kind of want to point out, too, to kind of circle it back around to these concepts of identity, culture, and community, that fry bread can often encourage certain community elements because we maybe eat it at things like powwows or have, you know, cultural events that's screened there. But if just one note before I continue on, if you're not speaking or if you don't have a question, if you don't mind turning off your microphone, we're getting a little bit of feedback here on the other end, and it can be a little distracting. So thank you. Mike, I'm wondering if you don't mind going a little bit into this history, into the federal policy and the history of allotments, and how this feeds into the history of fry bread within Native American reservations.
I'm getting a lot of feedback on my end too.
Yeah, are we?
That guy has a lockjaw.
Can I just go ahead and go for it?
For all those participating classes, if you don't mind, I'm not sure whose class it is, but if you don't mind muting your microphone, we're getting a little bit of feedback here on this side of things.
Go ahead, I'll share my screen again.
Yeah, sure.
Can I have them? Come on, hey,
I should have using
Just now.
See,
yes.
you don't even apply to your snap. I do.
That's so. prior to European arrival, we had all these, unique
Do you want to write something?
food procurement and processing methods that was unique to each tribe. Some tribes were hunting, some tribes were doing fishing, others, were doing seasonal rounds and gathering. A lot of farming that was out there in Indian communities. We have this stereotype that Indians weren't farmers, but there was a lot of cultural groups that did farm. We had these diverse social systems and ceremonies around food. You mentioned federal Indian policy. Well, that third bullet's talking about that particularly indigenous people really changed their diets and then also altered their relationship with food. And so that's a direct result of federal Indian policy like, boarding schools and allotment and all those things designed to eliminate Indian cultures and make them dependent on the U.S. government.
Communism.
What's cool now is we have this concept of, or this era of tribal self-determination. And so now we're seeing indigenous peoples really look at these serious issues in their communities and going back to traditions, going back to ceremonies to really decolonize themselves. And I've got a button here I'll share with you after I'm done with these slides, but we talk about tribes being sovereign nations, and that comes up with food. We've seen it here in Montana, where the Crow tribes and tribal members were hunting in Wyoming for elk. They got fined by the Wyoming Department for not having a license, but they went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided that yes, according to the Treaty of 1851, the Crow people can still hunt in those traditional areas. And same things happened out on with some of the West Coast tribes regarding salmon and whale, and going back to treaties saying we can exercise our sovereignty to maintain cultural traditions. So that gets at these essential understandings about, essential understanding 3, saying these beliefs that are thousands of years old still persist today. People still practice these traditions today, in spite of all these federal Indian policies, and that these ways our tribes are exercising their sovereign rights in relationship to the land and the environment and their foods. And that is powerful. And so this fits in with one of our science standards too. We talk about all these, things going on with climate change. Well, these have a direct impact on Native communities. Well, we can go back and look at Native Americans and the relationship with the environment and use that scientific knowledge to, make it better for everybody, not just for Indian communities. So I think that concept of relationships and balance and indigenous wisdom really can help everybody, as we move forward. So that's one of our science standards that we have. I think is pretty cool. And so we have curriculum. So students across Montana and across the U.S. can learn about this indigenous food movement, food sovereignty, and what all that means. And I think it can help everybody, not just the Native communities. So I'll stop my screen share here, but I also hit one of these buttons I picked up at a conference. I'll hold it up here to the camera. I don't know if you can see what that says. It says decolonize the diet. And so I think that's really what we're trying to do with these, indigenous food, food sovereignty efforts is really to decolonize our mindset regarding food and our relationship to it. Go back to those, healthy ways of living that are based around culture and identity and community. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's a good point, and it kind of makes me think of, in the film, there was this one scene when they're talking about the food pyramid, and they're comparing it to the medicine wheel. And I'm wondering if any students can maybe, if they remember, or they can write down a few of those foods that were mentioned. I know we kind of talked about those 3 sister foods. If anybody maybe wants to share a few examples, whether they noticed them in the film or specific examples that they identify with from that.
Absolutely. You can go ahead and type that in, or if you would like to, you may unmute your microphone, and we'd love to hear from you. always takes a second. I see people are thinking hard. I see lots of thought. This might be a good opportunity for you to turn and talk and just think about what some of those foods are. Oh, Mrs.
I
Nicholson
see.
said our class just changed, so they've got to do some more tomorrow. So thank you very much. They said their class just had to take off, as that happens with different timed classes.
So as we kind of finish things up today, I want to kind of circle back around to this. We've talked a lot about the history of food sovereignty and what this means to our cultural roots. And I'm curious if there is a few examples given in the film. Karen, I wonder if you might talk a little bit about your experience when you were filming this, what you see as potential solutions to this food sovereignty movement. It sounds like, according to Mike, we're heading in the right direction. We have examples in the state of Montana, like the Fort Peck Bison Project and local community co-ops that are gardening projects within smaller communities to get a little bit more connection to the land. But I'm wondering, Karen, if you can give a few examples that maybe were mentioned in the film of what are some solutions that we can turn to be a little bit more in tune with what we're eating and kind of how to encourage a healthier relationship with our food.
And Karen, before you start, just one more thing to input is that Mrs. Bartlett's class had some really great suggestions to that last question. So they had salmon, paper bread, whale blubber, and grasshoppers were things that they noticed from the film.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's a great example.
Yeah. So sorry about that. Go ahead, Karen.
It's a big question. And I think that with any other major problem, it's going to be solved or resolved incrementally. So that said, what do we have? We have increasing of gardens in the Muckleshoot community, and they've done a whole lot with that. We have some hunting, and you've already talked about some of the hunting, what's going on, even dealing with the Supreme Court. You have an awareness. A lot of what Roxanne did by getting a few people to go on a pre-contact diet for 3 months was building awareness. It's a lot of little things. It's a lot of people taking leadership, as we featured in the film, and saying we are going to make a difference. I think in many cases, as we talk to young people, hey, you're learning a lot. Go home and tell your parents and your grandparents about some of the things you've learned. Nobody wants to be sick. Everybody wants to be healthy. It's hard to give up, and everybody will tell you all the things that you think you just love to eat. But it's also a lot of fun to grow food and to plant it and to harvest it. And you can look at different ways of how you can have fun and how important it is. And one of the things that came out in the film that I just think is so important, and Mike just sort of touched on this, is the spiritual connection that people felt when they ate their traditional foods. So what does a spiritual connection mean? It meant they were more closely aligned with who they are and proud of who they are. And they wanted to communicate this to other people. And it also means, and I think most profoundly, they felt good inside. So to sum up, it's a lot of incremental changes, but it's a lot of saying, whoever you are, we can make a difference. We can feel closer to who we are, and we can be healthier.
Well, and on that note, too, since we are a film institute and we do host a documentary film festival, a big component of sharing this film is that it is a nonfiction film. But Karen, you talked a little bit about your process of even just doing research into this subject. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about your role as both director, producer, and writer of a film like this, and how long that took you to make a film like this. I mean, it's only about, 25 minutes long. Do you think you could give students an idea of the work that is put into and what the size of your team was to make a film like this?
This was a long process. This was 5 or 6 years. life intervened in many ways for me, so that takes time. I have a family, I'm a grandmother. Everybody counts. So that said, the process is one of following the lead along. So I became interested in what does it mean to be obese, to be Native American. And I started reading, and a lot of the kinds of things that Mike was able to put on the screen were the kinds of things that really drew my attention. And originally the film was going to be about 3 different women who had made a difference, but only one was involved with food, and that was Roxanne. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that food was the most critical. And so it became more devoted to food. I met someone who had put together a publication called Native Foodways, and she put me in the direction of Kibi Kante and also Valerie Seacrest and also Desiree Jackson in Alaska. And I found the other 2 people by myself. So I will say it's a very, very long process. Team, I had someone who did the transcriptions, and was always surprised because I did all the interviewing, how much I didn't remember because I was so intensely involved in the interviewing. I worked with different people who shot, and there's a little funny story here, and an editor who got it, and I looked far and wide for an editor. I have edited another documentary film that I did, but I was slow. And it's really important to get input from a lot of people. And one of the things when you do something like a documentary is I was at the helm. I had a vision, which I couldn't totally articulate, but it's getting people to bring from their skills and efforts what they can do and making it much better than what I ever could have done for myself. I took 2 grandsons with me to Alaska, and that was the only pictures I have of myself interviewing, because I asked the older grandson to take pictures, and then he never let me have my camera back the whole time we were there because he was having such a good time with it, and he is a credit on the film. So that sort of gives me a little pleasure. It's a long process. It's following it along. There's a lot of things that go wrong or don't go the way I want them to. And then you keep on saying, no, we're on to something. This is important. It's a lot of work.
Mm-hmm. That's a nice reminder. I'm sure we've all worked on projects or got excited about something, and then you reach a point where you get a little overwhelmed with all the information and how much more you have to know. And I always like to remind students that we all have stories to tell, and we all have personal experiences, and sometimes it takes just turning to the person next to you and saying, what did you do this morning? And maybe they, picked up a, something that they found on the side of the road that they might thought was an artifact. And these kind of tell you more moments that, you don't have to know all the biggest, flashiest people to tell a really compelling story that's close to home. And I know something I love about Montana is there's such a diversity of people in this state. And what is great about this film club is that you're all tapping in from across the state, and we're kind of able to come together here and share our own stories about where we get our foods and how do you make a movie. And so I appreciate everybody kind of coming together here for this little bit of time as we discuss these really important aspects of Montana history. On that note, I would love to open this up for any questions or comments from students in the classrooms that maybe haven't been able to speak or can give a few examples within their own communities that really resonated with them. Are there certain foods that you eat on special holidays? Only certain times of the year? And if so, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, absolutely. You can type any questions in or respond to that question either in the chat, or if you want to unmute your microphone, you are welcome to chat with us as well. So we'll give you a few minutes to think about that. Oh, I see Mrs. Bartlett. She's coming.
Is there a comment there?
Yep, we do. We have a comment, and then Mrs. Bartlett, when you're ready to unmute, go ahead and unmute your microphone. So Arlie says that the camas bakes occur once per year.
The canvas bakes?
Camas.
Camas bakes.
The camas root.
Oh, for the camas root. And what, do they want to share a little bit more about what camas root is, maybe?
Mrs. Bartlett, yours is being very tricky. I'm not sure why it's not unmuting. We might have to have you type in.
Thanks for being patient with these
We're very sorry.
difficulties that we are.
It's the bulb that you cook in the ground in a pit. And Sam is talking about the special holidays where they eat certain foods. So like ham and turkey on Thanksgiving or Christmas, and then they have camas bakes as well.
Oh, I've never heard of those.
I'm curious, Sam, what do you eat the camas with?
So as we wait for that, are they typing? Great.
So Sam's comment isn't connected to the camas. He was just talking about certain foods that they eat during this holiday time of year that is coming up.
Oh, great.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Well, before we leave you guys, I would love to hear from students. So, and I know that it's on camera, so it can be a little nerve-wracking sometimes, but I'm curious if everybody has a piece of paper, if students would, I like to do this exercise 3, 2, 1, which for older students might seem a little bit, for younger students, but it's a great way to reflect on what we've just talked about. I would love you to write 3 things that you've learned from today's discussion, 2 questions you still have based on what we've talked about today, and 1 thing you're excited about, whether you're looking forward to something that you'll be cooking with your family here soon, or something that's on the horizon, or something you didn't know about that is really piqued your interest. So if you could write that on a piece of paper, and then teachers can get those to us our way. And if you have any follow-up questions for either me, Mike, or Karen, you can get in touch with us after this discussion, and we'd be happy to answer those and stay in touch. Thank you so much for joining us today. Karen, if you'd like to add anything before we say goodbye, we'll take this time to have some closing remarks.
What I want to add is I'm delighted that the film is out there and seems to be making a difference. I can't tell you how that touches me, and it matters. And the last thing I want to add, that for all the years put into the film, I ended up with something less than a half hour, but I am so hoping it is the absolute that it has expressed the essence of the issues.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing that. And on that note too, if you students on your piece of paper want to write down something that you think you might want to make a film about, or something that's in your community that you're really interested in, we'd love to hear from you here over at the Institute and get some ideas about local stories in your communities that you're interested in exploring. And Mike, thank you as always. I'm surprised I didn't hear any new jokes so far in this discussion yet far, but maybe you have one to share before we say our goodbyes.
Yeah, I've got a couple of this really quick. And so, Karen, one of the groups you interviewed was down with the pioneers with the Oglala Lakota. Is that right? The Lakota word is friend is kola. Kola means friend in Lakota. And the Lakota word for enemy is unkola. And if you have a Lakota friend that's trying to lose weight, you call him diet cola. And if you have a Lakota friend that's got a sore throat, you call him Ricola. There's a new joke for you there. So.
I always like to end on a joke. Thank you for sharing. It is kind of that cold time of year, so that's a good one to keep in mind every time you pop a Ricola. One last reminder before we say goodbye to you guys is that on December 12th, we'll be screening our last film club screening of this fall season. We'll be exploring Native and Indigenous influence on popular culture music. So staying with the theme of restoration, we're exploring how music comes into play with cultural expressions within tribal identities. The film is Rumble. If you want to go to the next slide, Allie.
Oh, of course. Oh, hold on. Wrong computer.
Oh.
There we go.
It'll be on Thursday, December 12th at 1 p.m. Montana time for any of you that are interested in participating. The sign-up link you can find on Inspired Classroom's website and at bigskyfilmfest.net. We have a Native Filmmaker Initiative Film Club page that is easy access for students to sign up, and we do provide curriculum and discussion guides to go alongside this. We encourage teachers to watch these films ahead of time and remind their students that it is a live interaction, so we would love to hear those discussion questions before we dive into things. On that note, thanks again for joining us, guys, and if you have any other follow-up questions, we'd love to hear from you. But until then, we'll see you on December 12th. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.